Welcome back to Fundamentals of Philosophy. In our previous lecture, we examined philosophy through the Beardsley's naturalized account of philosophical inquiry. In this lecture, we transition from the question of what philosophy is to the question of why philosophy matters, by trading in the Beardsley's lens of conceptual analysis for the axiological lens of Bertrand Russell, which examines the value of philosophy, its transformative power, and its capacity to liberate the mind. Meet Bertrand Russell. Russell stands at the forefront of the 20th century turn towards modern analytic philosophy. A logician, a mathematician, a social critic, a Nobel laureate, and a public philosopher, Russell represents one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, and we will encounter him again and again throughout this course. Over his lifetime, Russell produced an enormous volume of work which stands as a model of the Beardsley's criteria of clarity, reasonableness, and consistency. Russell developed logicism, a monumental theory which attempted to derive the entirety of mathematics from the principles of philosophical logic. He developed the theory of logical atomism, which demonstrated how any statement can be broken down into simple atomic components. His theory of descriptions led to significant advances in the fields of both philosophy and linguistics. His work in mathematics revolutionized the development of contemporary set theory. Collectively, these contributions established the foundational methodology of contemporary analytic philosophy. But Russell didn't confine himself to abstract conceptual analysis. He also wrote extensively and provocatively on politics, ethics, and value, in a voice and a style that was both accessible and engaging to public audiences. We'll encounter the analytic Russell in later modules. In The Value of Philosophy, it is Russell the social critic and value theorist that we encounter. To understand the force of Russell's essay, we first have to understand the historical context that it emerged from. Every society and every historical era has its own set of ideas about the way things are, which is to say that they have some set of ordinary beliefs that seem obvious from the inside, but might seem strange or even appalling from the vantage point of some other time or place. Russell wrote The Value of Philosophy in 1912, at the height of the British Empire. Britain had, at this time, colonized a full quarter of the planet's surface and ruled over approximately 400 million people. It was a colonial project of breathtaking scope, driven by the emergence of industrial capitalism, the acceleration of technological innovation, and the standardization of bureaucratic efficiencies. Together, these worldviews painted a picture which interpreted all value through the lens of material production and market utility, a picture that appeared to be validated by Britain's position of uncontested global dominance. In Russell's Britain, the ordinary beliefs of everyday citizens had come to reflect a deeper set of philosophical beliefs about the nature of value, a view that could be called instrumental reason. The only value recognized by instrumental reason is material value. The only questions that it considers worth asking are questions with definite answers that can be transformed into practical results. All serious and practical men recognize that this was just the way things are. But where administrative bureaucrats saw the efficient machinery of empire, Russell saw a prison for the mind and the soul. When considering the why and how of Russell's critique of common sense, it's important to recognize that he was not some outsider throwing stones from the margins. Russell emerged from the highest echelons of British aristocracy. His grandfather served twice as prime minister. His godfather was the legendary philosopher John Stuart Mill, who we will read in Module 6. He was educated at the prestigious Cambridge University, where he would go on to teach logic, mathematics, and philosophy for 2 decades. Russell was a critic emerging from the very heart of empire. When he spoke, people listened. This made him dangerous as well as influential. Russell was a fierce critic of what counted for the common sense of his time, challenging established institutions such as marriage, monogamy, work, and religion. But it was his opposition to war and the tools of war that ultimately brought the fist of empire down upon him. His pacifism cost him his position at Cambridge. He was imprisoned twice, once during World War I and again at age 89 for allegedly inciting civil disobedience during nuclear disarmament protests. Not bad for a 90-year-old. For most people, losing your job and being repeatedly jailed for political agitation would lead to a dark outcome. But Russell, the philosopher aristocrat, was not most people. At the age of 78, He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in recognition of his humanitarian work, and he remained a thorn in the side of the establishment until his death at the age of 97. The Value of Philosophy demonstrates that the two sides of Russell's thought, Russell the dispassionate logician and Russell the political firebrand, both in fact flow from the same philosophical source. The article represents a subtly devastating critique presented in the form of an ironic defense. The pretext is that Russell is defending the pursuit of philosophy against charges of impracticality, but this is just the opening move in a much larger argument. The target of Russell's critique is what he ironically refers to as the common sense of practical men. The paradigm of instrumental reason is the progress of empirical science. To be clear, Russell was no opponent of scientific progress. His philosophical legacy is grounded in his commitments to both the findings of empirical science and to the rigor of logical analysis. But Russell was deeply skeptical of any philosophy that reduced all value to the immediate, direct, and quantifiable achievement of wealth, power, and progress. The man who has no tincture of philosophy, Russell writes, goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual beliefs of his age or his nation, and from convictions which have grown up in his mind without the cooperation or consent of his deliberate reason. This is what Russell means by the tyranny of custom, and why he criticizes the common sense of practical men. Such common sense to Russell is a prison. What passes for common sense in any given time and place is often nothing more than the unexamined prejudices of that particular culture. Beliefs that are accepted not because they're true, but because they've never been adequately questioned. The questions of philosophy are both unsettled and unsettling. They force us to expand our thoughts beyond what passes for conventional wisdom in our local corner of the universe. And the value of philosophy lies exactly in its power to liberate us from the narrow preconceptions of our time and place. Once liberated, we are then free to get to work transforming both ourselves and our society. Russell was a critic of vulgar pragmatism, but he was not impractical. The tools of logical analysis that he helped develop are finely tuned instruments for the dismantling of conventional fictions and for the building of newer and stronger foundations based upon critical, ethical reasoning. Philosophy for Russell is an act of rebellion, an act of willful liberation from all beliefs that are forced upon us without our knowledge or consent, the implicit biases that color our era of history, the invisible prejudices that distort our perceptions of the world, the narrow and provincial habits of self-interest and social dogma that constitute our webs of beliefs. Philosophy provides us with the tools to transcend all of these, to gain a wider perspective than what was handed to us at birth by the accidental dogmas of our time and place, to approach a truly objective and universal perspective, and to see as God might see, without a here and now, without hopes and fears, without the trammels of customary beliefs and traditional prejudices. This is how we transcend the tyranny of custom, take genuine control over our destinies, and become truly ourselves, rather than merely carriers and reproducers of other people's ideas and histories. For Russell, philosophy begins where science ends, at the very horizon of the human capacity for comprehending the universe. From a cosmological perspective, humans are a young species. An alien anthropologist teaching a class on the history of Earth would primarily be telling a story about a dinosaur planet, with humans maybe appearing as a brief footnote somewhere in the final lecture. And yet, in our brief time, humans have developed science, from Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics. We've developed psychology. We've decoded the mathematical language of nature itself. And every one of these fields began as a question within the domain of philosophy. It was only when reliable methods for delivering consistent results had been developed that science, mathematics, and psychology broke off into the independent disciplines that we recognize today. As a result, the questions that remain within the domain of philosophy are the really difficult questions. The questions that science, mathematics, and other disciplines have not been able to successfully answer. Philosophy, in Russell's view, is the domain of uncertainty. And uncertainty is valuable. Imagine a world where all puzzles have been solved, where all questions have been answered, and where no uncertainties remain. Imagine the world as a solved equation, scrawled on a blackboard, with every numeral slotted perfectly into place. A world without surprises, without discovery, a world without wonder. That, to Russell, is the world without philosophy. There can be no progress in such a world because progress presupposes the solution of problems. And in the world of the settled and the certain, there are, by definition, no problems left to solve. A world without philosophy is a dead world. And progress, if there is to be progress, demands minds capable of guiding it. The value of philosophy resides in its ambiguities, because the world is ambiguous. The world is uncertain. To face such a world requires minds trained in navigating uncertainty and in negotiating ambiguity. And the questions of philosophy are not merely uncertain, they are also momentous. The nature of consciousness, the character of morality, the properties of reality itself. These are puzzles that have lived with us for thousands of years. They have resisted the efforts of every science and every technology. They may exist beyond the capacity of human reason to fully grasp, and yet we strain at them. We push ourselves beyond our limits. To meet the greatness of such questions, we must ourselves become great. The questions of philosophy are the stones against which we sharpen our critical reasoning. Such questions aren't means to an end. They aren't some algorithm designed to generate a list of agreed-upon certainties. They are valuable in themselves because they force us to reckon with the unsettled and the unsettling. Uncertainty in philosophy isn't a bug, it's a feature. And with our critical tool sharpened, we return to the mundane and the practical, transformed, and ready to set about the business of transforming the world. And there is practical value here, but it is indirect rather than direct value. The common knowledge a decade ago was that the only valuable degrees were in the computer sciences. As a result, universities generated an unprecedented number of computer engineers who accelerated the development of automation technologies that in turn eliminated the need for computer engineers. Specialized degrees are only as good as the need for specialized jobs, but critical reasoning skills are valuable for any job in any field. Critical reasoning is a transferable skill. Philosophy has survived for thousands of years. It precedes every other field of study, and it will remain so long as minds exist that are still capable of wonder. What ordinary common sense beliefs are held by all practical people of our own time? What assumptions do we take for granted? What beliefs about the way things are have become so naturalized through everyday use that we no longer recognize them as beliefs at all? How might the ordinary customs and practices of our time and place show up to a future anthropologist examining the culture of the early 21st century? These are the questions that Russell puts to us, but there are questions that we should put to him as well. Does philosophy truly end where science begins? In Module 2, we will take a look at the philosophy of science, which turns a critical eye to the supposedly settled questions of contemporary science. And what about Russell's notion that philosophy allows us to see as God might see, to obtain a truly objective and universal perspective of the world? With one hand, Russell celebrates philosophy's uncertainty and its refusal to provide definite answers. With the other hand, he claims that philosophy provides us with access to a universal perspective that transcends the limitations of any particular time or place. But is there really such an objective, universal view from nowhere? A perspective outside of history and culture from which we may evaluate history and culture? Or is Russell's philosophical liberation just another form of prejudice? The prejudice of a Cambridge aristocrat who assumes that his particular way of seeing things represents universal truth. We will return to this question later in the course. For now, let us trade in Russell's axiological lens on the value of philosophy for an existential lens that examines the embodied practice of philosophy as a way of life. In our next lecture, we will return to the source of the Western philosophical tradition, the philosopher Socrates of Athens, and ask whether the unexamined life is even worth living. And I'll see you there.